Platform exam prep session for PL200 Microsoft Power Platform Functional Consultant. I'm Anupama Natarajan. I'll be your instructor for today's session. And today's session, we are going to look at the practice test. So what it takes in order to prepare for PL200. Of course, for the past few days, we have been doing the different topics around PL200. So we started with day one on Power Platform overview, moved on to understanding like what are the skills that you require as a functional consultant. Followed by that, we started to focus upon the different components within Power Platform family. So like Dataverse, then we moved on to Power Apps, where we learned about model-driven applications, Canvas applications, Power Apps portals, and how do we build Power Automate flows and the different type of flows that you can create within the Power Automate component, and how do you create a chatbot from scratch without writing single line of code using Power Virtual Agents. And finally, we wrapped up the training session with understanding how to analyze data using Power BI. So again, with Power BI, we looked at the different tools in Power BI. How do you get started with Power BI? What are the different concepts you need to know? And how about creating the report, publishing it on the portal and consume it using a Power BI mobile? So quite a few set of topics that we looked across the board when we started talking about PL200. So what is the focus of today's session? So here we are going to look at a good overview around the Power Platform Functional Consultant certification. So we will be walking you through what is the learning path of PL200 looks like. And when you take up the PL200 exam, you need to understand what are the different types of questions, the format of exam questions that you can expect in the PL200 exam. So we will also look at a recap of the different topics that we covered across the 3 days in our training session, and some exam tips and some sample questions to feel yourself comfortable like, okay, so these topics I have gone through during the training session and I know what are the things I have to prepare on, and how do I approach the PL200 questions during the Microsoft certification exam. Finally, we will wrap up saying okay, what it takes to book the Microsoft exam, and also how do you redeem your measure up practice test, and any additional resources, things that you need to know before we wrap up today's session. So there is a lot of tips and tricks, and how do you go about understanding how do you answer some of those questions with PL200 certification. So let us break into today's session. So we are going to get started with the Power Platform Functional Consultant Certification Overview. So what does this associate certification really mean, and how does the pathway look like? So if you have focused around Microsoft certifications in the last few years, one thing you would have noticed is all the certifications that we have got is all role-based. So previously, Microsoft used to have technology-based certifications. So we write something in C# or XML, or your technical skills will be measured in that fashion. But now it's all going to be role-based. What does role-based really mean? So when you join an organization, you just join with a particular role. So whether you will become a functional consultant or a developer or a data analyst or an app maker or an architect. So you will actually take up a role in the organization. So when you take up a role, there are certain skills that is expected to be performed using that role. So what the Microsoft certification these days do is to test for those skills. When you're applying for this role, whether you have got the skills in order to perform those roles effectively. So that is a technical skill set that will be measured as part of the certification exam. When you take up the Power Platform certifications, you start here, like in terms of Power Platform Fundamentals, which is your PL900 exam. Once you have successfully certified in that, then you move on to the associate exams and then to the expert. Within the associate exam, you have got four, which is the Power Platform App Maker, which is your PL100. Followed by that is Power Platform Functional Consultant is PL200. And then Power Platform Developer, which is your PL400, and Data Analyst is DA100. So you can pick up any of these associate certifications, maybe one or more than one, doesn't matter. And finally, you can move on to the expert level certification by taking up the Power Platform Solutions Architect, which is your PL600. So the emphasis of this particular session is going to be around PL200, which is Power Platform Functional Consultant, and it is part of the associate certification. So what it takes to become a Power Platform Functional Consultant Associate, and who is the certification really for? So this certification is mainly for candidates who can create application enhancements, better user experience, data integration and conversion and process automation, and even building visualizations. So I think pretty much we covered the spectrum of the different components of the Power Platform family there. So what are the key skills that is going to be measured as part of this exam? How do you configure Dataverse? So as you know, like a Dataverse is an important thing for model-driven applications. So you need to know exactly how do you create tables, how do you build relationships, and how do you define the different type of columns within the tables and so on. How do you create applications using Power Apps, irrespective of whether it's a model-driven app or Canvas app? How do you go about developing it? So you need to know exactly what things are doable in those type of applications and not doable, and when to choose what. And how do you create and manage Power Automate? So we saw quite an interesting set of Power Automate flows created during our sessions, training sessions. And so there will be questions related to Power Automate around the type of flows that we are using and what things that you can do, what are connectors, and what type of connectors that we can use within Power Automate. You need to know how to implement Power Virtual Agent chatbots, given this is going to be not a code written chatbot. Instead, it is a graphical user interface driven chatbots. So the expectation is to, how to implement that. And integrating Power Apps with other apps and services. This is again an important aspect. So as I told you, like the components within the Power Platform family, you can quite happily integrate them across the board. So you can integrate like a Power Apps application inside a Power BI, or you can integrate Power Automate flows inside Power Apps and so on. So you can interchangeably use them and integrate them. So these are some of the skills that will be measured. The reason I'm highlighting the skills measured because these are the topics under which the questions will be asked. So if you're preparing for the PL200 exam, you have to give proper emphasis on those topics where the questions will be focused on. If you pass the PL200 exam, then pretty much you earn the Power Platform Functional Associate certification. And this will be really a valuable certification, especially if you are a person who is working with your stakeholders in order to understand their needs and then pass on to your technical team in order to get that delivered. So how do you prepare for the Power Platform Functional Consultant Associate certification? So if you're attending this session as well as the previous training sessions, you are on the right path. You are just getting familiarized with the different objectives and topics that will be covered as part of PL200 exam. But also you have got the official training that is available to do. So depending on your timing, what you have got in terms of availability, you can choose either an instructor-led training or a self-paced online training with Microsoft Learn. So with instructor-led training, you have a 5-day training for PL200 exam. So pretty much like all the different objectives we talked about will be discussing in detail along with the labs. Self-paced online training is people who can't just spend 5 days in a training session. What you can do is you have modules available on MS Learn, and you can just prepare each and every module. And once you're happy that you have completed them, then you are good to take up the PL200 exam. So this is pretty much doing the training in a self-paced mechanism by yourself. Irrespective of whether you do the instructor-led training or self-paced online training with Microsoft Learn, what it will help you is once you successfully finish the training, you can become like or take up the exam to become the PL200 Power Platform Functional Consultant. So let us quickly look at the MS learning path for PL200. So we talked about like there is a learning path that is available. So how do we go about preparing using the learning path? So the learning path for Power Platform Functional Consultant is available on the MS Learn website. So let me quickly jump onto that and get that for you. So this is actually helps you to prepare for the exam so that you know exactly how do you take it up. So this is the Power Platform Functional Consultant exam page. If you scroll down here, so you can schedule the exam from here, as well as once you scroll down, you can see the learning path that is available to take up the exam. So this is the free material that you have got on MS Learn to do your training in a self-paced manner yourself. So getting started with Dataverse, you have 7 modules in there. How do you manage permissions and administration for Dataverse? How do you create a Canvas application in Power Apps? How do you create a model-driven application in Power Apps? How do you create a business process flow using Power Automate and automating a business process using Power Automate? And some general practices to govern Microsoft Power Platform environments, modules related to Power BI, Power Virtual Agents. It's good to understand a bit about AI Builder also. And that wraps up your modules that you need to prepare for the PL200 certification. So as you can see here, this is laid out under the certification page itself. So if you're looking for those modules, they are easily available and accessible from there. So now we have seen what it takes to prepare for PL200 exam, the objectives that we need to focus on. The next thing to look at is what is the type of exam question formats that you can look for. So the first one is your multiple choice question format. So normally with this question format, you will be presented with a short scenario followed by one or more questions. So you need to answer one particular answer to select from these list of options provided to you. So this is really straightforward. Any multiple choice question will be presented in this fashion. So short scenario, read through the scenario and a question related to that scenario, and you need to pick an answer from that appropriate option. The next one is your hot spot format. So again, the same thing here. You will be presented with a short scenario or a case, and then it will be followed by one or more multiple options to be selected. And the choices which you want to select can be a drop down or a radio button or a checkbox format. So score is actually gained for each correct answer choice. So one thing to keep in mind when it comes to multiple choice questions is like for you for every choice that you correct choice you make, you get the points. So it's not that like, okay, if you made one incorrect answer in a particular multiple choice question, that even if you have correct answers that you won't get any marks at all. That's not how it works. Basically, if you have like you have to select 3 out of the answers, and if you can answer 2 correctly, then you get the points for those 2. So one thing to keep in mind is there is no negative marking at all. So pay attention to the questions and try to answer as many as questions. Don't leave questions without answering at all. So without negative marking, like at least you can make a guess of what you think would be the right answer. The another question format is actually a build list format. So here you will be presented with a procedural task and a list of activities. You need to identify and build and order the necessary steps to complete the task. So for instance, they may ask like, okay, what are the steps to create a Canvas application? So then they will give you the list of actions like steps here. And they will say like, okay, which 4 actions that you perform to do that. So you have to drag and drop those 4 actions appropriately in the answer area. So one of the key thing to understand for these type of questions and where you have to pay attention, sometimes in the question they will say like, okay, you have to select the actions, but also you need to order them in the appropriate way how you perform it. So if you say order them, then probably it's not about dragging and dropping the actions, but also you need to arrange the options in the right order how it will be performed. So that is something to keep in mind. Sometimes they ask you to with order, sometimes they may ask you without ordering. So if they ask you with ordering, if you don't order them the actions appropriately, then you won't be getting the points for that. So that's what it says. So on the left hand side, you have the action objects, which you need to select and move into the action area on the right. You can drag the objects or you can use the arrow keys in the middle section of the screen to move the objects. If you want to remove your selection from the answer area, use the back arrow key or drag the selection back into the action list. So you can take them forward to the answer area, or if you think it is incorrect, you can bring them back into the action area. And to reorder your answer, you need to select up and down arrows on the right side of the screen. So these are the up and down arrows that you can use, or you can drag and drop them to reorder them. So pay attention for the build list format type of questions where you have to choose the actions, and if they ask you to order, you need to order them appropriately also. The next one is the drag and drop questions. You will be again presented with a short scenario, and this will be followed by a question which requires you to match the listed options to the given item or statement. So what it means is like again a short scenario, a question will be asked, you'll be presented with some options and you need to just say like, okay, if I want to perform this particular action, what should be the option I need to or tool I need to choose? So you need to just drag and drop them appropriately. One of the key thing to note in this type of questions is sometimes Microsoft put the statement here in the question saying each option may be used once, more than once, or not at all. What it means is sometimes a same tool can be used to perform multiple things. So in that case, you may use the same answer twice. So it is okay because they already said like the option can be used once, more than once, or sometimes an option cannot won't be used at all in the answer. So that is also is fine. Again, score is gained for each correct answer here. That is to keep in mind. So this is a cool one with a case study type of questions where you will be presented with a real world business case. So on the left hand side of the screen, you will be presented with certain menu options. So this will provide you a detailed background information about the case study. So case study is nothing but some information about a fictitious organization. So this can be like a background, what does the organization background is, what does the current landscape look like, what are the business and technical requirements and problem statements they have got. And with that, like they will also have requirements saying, okay, these are the problem we had before and these are the things that we want to implement to mitigate it. So this case study will have multiple questions associated with the business case, and each of this question will have a unique solution to meet the goals. The key point is like when you have case study, sometimes you may be provided a case study and you'll be asked around 4 to 5 questions associated from the case study. And the only thing is the case study is a separate section. So once you answer the 5 questions and finish it off, you can't come back and revisit the answers for the case study. So pay attention for the case study, answer all the questions, review all the answers before you move to the next section of the exam, because once you begin a new section within the exam, you will not be able to return back to the case study to change anything. So that is something to keep in mind when it comes to case study. And another thing is a lot of people think like, okay, there is a lot of information in the case study that you have to remember. So when they ask a question, so once you read through the case study, you go to the questions. How do I refer back to the case study? So normally a question will be asked here, but you can click on any of these tabs if you want to go back and read through the business requirements or technical requirements or even problem statements. It's not that like you can't go back or something. So every question will have the associated modules with the case study available below that. So you can go back and refer to that just in case if you couldn't recollect a whole lot of things. Cool. So now we are moving on to look at a recap of a few things that we learned across the training session in the last few days, some exam tips, and as well as some sample questions. So we talked about some of the skills that will be measured as part of the PL200 certification exam, given it's a role-based certification. So the key skills that will be measured as part of this exam is how do you configure Microsoft Dataverse? Like 20 to 25% of the exam questions will be based on that. How do you create apps by using Microsoft Power Apps? 15 to 20%. Creating and managing Microsoft Power Automate. 15 to 20% of the questions will be asked around that. Implementing Microsoft Power Virtual Agent chatbots. 10 to 15% of the questions will be asked around that. How do you integrate Microsoft Power Apps with other apps and services? 10 to 15% of the questions. And managing solutions like how do you create solutions? How do you export and import? Those type of things will be covered in this part, which is around 15 to 20% of the questions will be asked in there. So around 6 modules are there and you will be asked questions related to these modules. So we will be looking at some sample questions across each and every objectives or the skills that will be measured as part of the PL200 exam. The first one in that is configuring Microsoft Dataverse. So 20 to 25% of the questions will be asked around that. So what are the key things that you have to learn about Microsoft Dataverse? So Microsoft Dataverse, as you know, you will be going ahead and building your tables, your columns, relationships, like in case business rules, if there is anything. So these are the key ones. And how do you import and export data? So fundamentally, you create all these things in order to create a data model. So managing a data model is the key one. And part of that includes like how do you assign a type for a table, including standard, activity, or virtual? How do you configure table ownership? How do you create new tables or modify existing tables? How do you determine which type of relationships to implement? This includes one to many or many to many type of relationships. How do you configure table relationship behaviors, including cascading rules? So which we saw around, do you want to make sure that you delete all the child records when you delete the parent record, or you don't apply that rule at all? So these are things that you need to just define around when you are creating and configuring the tables. How do you create new relationships or modify existing relationships? Creating new columns or modify existing columns? And how do you configure table properties and connection rules and configure views? So as you can see here, there is a quite extensive thing. So if you get into Dataverse and if you start creating the different tables, relationships and things, you will get familiarized. And that is an important thing. So not about theoretically understanding it, but practically you should be doing it. The reason for that is like the ability for you to do this will help you to remember how to do these certain actions during the exam, especially like when you have questions where you have to perform the actions and in the appropriate order. If you want to choose what are those actions and how do you do them in the appropriate order, you need to know how to do that first of all in Dataverse. So doing the labs will be really helpful and handy for answering those type of questions. Then you will be focusing around creating and managing your logic. So here you will be defining your business rules and implementing the business rule logic and define what is the scope for those business rules and how do you go about configuring and testing them. And similarly with the Dataverse configuration, you will be configuring auditing, search, data management task, which I told you around import, export, bulk deduction. You can configure duplicate deduction, which we saw like it basically gives you a warning, but it doesn't stop you in committing your changes. How do you configure privacy preferences? And finally, security. So security is an aspect within Microsoft Dataverse. You need to know how do you create and manage business units, security roles, how do you provide permissions or privileges to the users and teams, and how do you manage the security when it comes to hierarchy. Last but not the least, how do you configure the Azure Active Directory group teams? So you can see here there is a wealth of topics that you have to prepare when it comes to preparing for Microsoft Dataverse, and 20 to 25% of the exam questions will be asked. So you have to clearly prepare well for this particular topic, and that will be really helpful for you to take up the exam. Cool. So the next thing we'll be looking here is some of the tips associated with Microsoft Dataverse. So what are the key tips that we are going to look at here? Data modeling. What does data modeling really mean? Data modeling is a process that you can use to define and analyze your data requirements and also their need to support your business processes. So you need to have a data model, especially if you have to build a model-driven application. So in one-to-N relationship type is basically where one record in the primary table is associated with zero or many records in a related table. So that's what a one-to-N relationship mean. And N-to-one relationship is nothing but you'll be looking at the relationship from the other side of the table. So that is something to keep in mind and not getting confused. So one-to-N and N-to-one are all the same. One-to-N means like you are looking it from the primary table, looking the relationship from primary table to the child table. N-to-one means you are looking the relationship from the child table to the primary table. That's why it looks as a N-to-one. Okay, let us look at the business rules. Business rules helps you to automate and enforce common requirements. I think we specifically looked at saying why there is a need, why do we need to put the business rule on the Dataverse environment? We configure business rules in Dataverse because, as I told you, like within the Power Platform family, you can have Power Apps connecting to Dataverse and Power Automate also connecting to Dataverse. And if you want to execute business rules, you don't need to implement them separately, one in Power Apps and another one in Power Automate. What you can do is really, so what you can do really is basically like you can have the business rules configured in Dataverse so that you can automate and enforce the common requirements there. So which is pretty much enforcing the rules in one place. Then you have your AI builder. So AI builder, as I told you, a tool that is used to infuse AI capability inside your Power Platform applications, whether it is Power BI or Power Apps or Power Automate, doesn't matter, and mainly used to do predictions, processing text from images. How do you recognize and count images in items in images and analyzing text for classification? So when we looked at AI Builder, a couple of things I mentioned is about pre-built AI models and custom AI models. So if your requirement is specific to your organization, like for instance, like you may have forms that are specific to organization, then you will be creating a custom model, form processing model. While if you have like a generic things, like a scanning passports, driver's license, or like doing sentiment analysis on text, these are all like custom AI, not custom AI models. These are pre-built AI models. So because these are generic things which can be easily applied on any industry, so we will be using like a pre-built AI models for that. So what is the difference is like pre-built AI models, Microsoft will be building the models, training the models. As an end user, we'll be just consuming the models. With custom AI models, you will be doing the training and you will be doing the creation of the model, retraining of the model and stuff, along with consuming the model. So the difference between custom and pre-built is pre-built model will be created and maintained by Microsoft. We will be just the consumers. Custom model, we will be creating the model, train the model, publish, consume it, and also retrain it on an ongoing basis. So that is something to notice and keep in mind. So a model cannot be used until it is published as a component in an app or as an action in flow or as a new data in your database. So this is the AI models that you create that you can't use them until it is published. Administrator settings can be configured for Power Platform settings like themes, notifications, passwords, and contact preferences. So you can do that using the admin portal for the Power Platform. So through there, you should be able to set up any of these settings quite easily. Data flows will allow you to transform and load the data into Dataverse environments or Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2. They define your data connections, ETL logic, and destination. So if you are having data sitting in your on-premises data stores or other cloud platforms, probably the first exercise is to bring the data inside Dataverse before you can build the application. So how do you bring the data into the Dataverse environment is using data flows. So it will allow you to do transformation and loading of your data into Dataverse environments. So think about in this way. So if you have to do a lot of data cleansing activity before you get the data into Dataverse, then probably you will be using data flows, which allows you to pull the data from different sources and also transform the data and finally load them back into the Dataverse tables. Canvas application is designed by dragging and dropping elements onto a canvas. And we saw like when do you use canvas applications versus model-driven applications. So canvas applications, if you need a full control around the UI, you will go down the canvas application path. Model-driven applications, you go in there, especially like if you have a data model already defined and you want to build application for that. Hierarchy security will allow managers to access the rows and do the work on their behalf. So basically what we are saying is like you can have managers who can also see subordinates records, and by doing the hierarchical security, you can give them the privilege to do so. Cool. So what are we going to do is quickly jump on to MeasureUp website. MeasureUp is actually, they provide you the practice test questions that you will practice to prepare for the Microsoft certification exam. These are practice questions, okay? So not all the questions that you see in MeasureUp will be asked in the exam, but it will help you to prepare yourself in terms of getting ready for the Microsoft exam. So let me quickly launch the practice test questions. Just bear with me here. Cool. So this is the practice test options on MeasureUp website. So one thing we will be doing here is you have the ability to customize. So for instance, I'm going to ask for maybe 5 questions. And as you can see there, like there are around 183 practice questions, and this is a good way of testing your knowledge. And you can say, okay, show me the questions only from the following objectives. And this is one of the thing that normally I use when I prepare certifications, especially using MeasureUp practice test. Is like I don't want to prepare all the objectives in one hit. Probably what I will do is I'll take questions related to one objective at a time and prepare for that. The key reason I will showcase to you when we start looking at the questions. Um, One is like we won't have a lot of time to allocate, like we are not going to prepare all the questions or all the topics in one day. We will be chunking it across different multiple days, right? So focusing on one topic will allow you to focus more around preparation rather than deviating from here to there and so on. So let us take up configuring Dataverse, and I'm going to include everything. So here I'm not excluding anything. So, and also I'm going to say like, okay, let me ask for each answer. I'll show you why I'm going down this option when I'm doing the training. So when I'm doing my preparation for the exam, I will always do this option because what it helps me is I can choose my answers and also I can validate whether it is right or not. Okay, so let us quickly look at some sample questions. You may look at some instructions on the screen and pay attention to these instructions and get into the habit of reading them. The main reason is that's why it is there. In Microsoft, when you're taking a Microsoft exam, there will be instructions also. So you have to read them because some instructions clearly will say like, okay, in this section, you have to complete all the answers, but once you complete it, you can't come back again to the section to change it. So it is good for you to understand those things before you go further on it. So first question we are looking at here. This is, you can see, multiple choice question type. You are a Power Platform functional consultant for a retail organization. You build a model-driven application that manages logistics for clothing products. The products have variants and are identified by the combination of item ID, color, and size. You need to allow both the store ordering and the stock control systems to update the logistics system with the product stock request and changes. These external systems need to set the quantity available and quantity ordered columns. What solution should you use? That is the most direct solution with the least amount of effort. Create a Power Automate cloud flow that uses the list rows action to find the product ID, GeoID using item ID, color, and size columns. Create a custom action to query the product table using the item ID, color, and size columns to find the GeoID for the product row. Create an alternate key on the product table using the item ID, color, and size columns. And write a plugin to retrieve the product GeoID using the item ID, color, and size column. So you can see here, there is quite a few answers that has been provided. I'm going to quickly show you the answer. Not going to delay that. This is the correct answer, but the key point to note here is the explanation part. So when you are preparing for the certification, especially with the measure of practice test, the explanation part is really important to understand. It helps you to understand why the certain answer is a correct answer. So in this case, creating an alternate key on the product table using item ID, color, and size columns is the correct answer. So a model-driven application normally uses the data from Dataverse, and all the rows in the Dataverse, they are uniquely identified using your GeoID. So the GeoID is internal to Dataverse, so external systems may not know about this. So that's why you can use the alternate key column where you can update the rows without other systems knowing what the GeoID relates to that. So alternate key is much more mechanism, so you can store the keys the other systems can understand in there in order to update that record. So that is the correct answer, right? But also pay attention for the answers that are incorrect. So don't read only what is the explanation for the correct answer. Pay attention for the answers that are incorrect also. The reason for that is like you shouldn't use Power Automate Cloud Flow to perform, and this is inefficient, and it requires two calls, the query and then the update rather than the single update call. So it didn't say you can't do it. You can still do it with Power Automate Cloud Flow. But if you note down the question here, it clearly says like you have to implement a solution with least amount of effort. Sometimes you have to pay attention to these key words in the question. Least amount of effort or minimizing the cost. All those things are really important to know because there may be multiple ways of solving the problem. But when you look at this particular one, the statements that will help you to choose which is the appropriate one from the filtered list of answers. So that's the reason you're not using the Power Automate Cloud Flow. You shouldn't use a custom action because the custom action cannot query on its own and it requires custom code to perform the query. You're not writing a plugin to the query, and a plugin requires custom code and coding requires developer, which means it's inefficient and it requires multiple calls. So that's how you will eliminate the answers. So another technique with the Microsoft questions is using the trick of eliminating the answers. So what you can do is you can quickly check, okay, which answers you can easily eliminate and then appropriately using the correct answers from there on. Okay, so this is another bill list type of questions where you just drag and drop things and order them. So let us look at the question here. You are a Power Platform administrator managing a contact management system. You are supplied with a CSV file of contact records. You receive a new file with the same columns weekly. You need to import this file into the contacts entity and reduce administrative efforts for future imports. Which of the six actions should you perform and in sequence? So that is clearly says like you have to do that in order. To answer, move the appropriate actions from the list of possible actions and then you can just arrange them in the correct order. So one thing you can do is you can move them like this and then reorder them if you want. So if you want to just reorder them, or what you can do is like this, or you can move them back here if you see like, okay, I'm not clear about that. So this is the way how you use the list. So let us quickly look at the answer for this one. So this is basically saying how do you import within Dataverse. So you need to know how to run the import data wizard. So you select the CSV, you specify the columns and the delimiters, then you choose contact as the record type where the import of the records is going to happen, map the columns and map the data name. So you can't, if you get the order incorrect, then you will lose the points here. So order is really important. And if you ask me how do I know to do this correctly, I would say practice importing records inside Dataverse, and that will help you to familiarize with the steps. So first, the correct answer is you should run the import data wizard, and it will allow you to import the files into Dataverse database. Then you can search for the CSV file. Then you specify the columns and data delimiters. Choose the entity type or the record type. In this case, it's context. And then you map the columns, and then you just get the records imported in there. So these are the other ones which you won't be using in this scenario. So you are a Power Platform functional consultant implementing a model-driven app. You do not initially use the account and contact tables, but plan to use them in a later phase. You need to perform minimal configuration to hide these tables from the users. Use business roles, classic workflow, sitemap, or security roles. So what you need to do is you need to just you need to hide them from the users, but you will be using them because you will be using them at a later phase, and what you will be doing in order to do that. So if you look at the answer for this, you'll be using the security roles. Why security roles? This is where the explanation in here is really good. So you use security roles because security roles like you can assign privileges, and if a person doesn't have a read privilege, they won't be able to see that across anywhere in the UI. And this is a simple way of implementing it. Sitemap is because like if you remove the tables from the sitemap, it will remove from the navigation, but it will still be searchable from advanced find. Classic workflow cannot alter your user interface, and similarly like business rules cannot prevent you to view the tables in the UI. Another thing to note down in the measure of practice test is your references. So every question will have a list of URLs, and when you click on this URL, you'll be taken into a page on docs.microsoft.com, so where you can read more information about that particular thing. So like what is security role, what privileges that you can assign to them. Because as I told you, like your exam questions is not the exact questions that you see in measure of practice test. So you still will be asked some questions outside this. So that's why learning about this topic a bit more will help you to address any other things, questions that may be asked in the exam. The another thing I told you, like normally I take one objective at a time and prepare exactly for this reason. So if you note it down, like we had to understand, read the explanation, understand the correct answer, and also about the incorrect answers. Then there will be references. Sometimes there may be 5 or 6 links in the references. So you may need to go there and also read through that to get familiarized, like do I know about these topics or have I missed something in my preparation? So when you do that, pretty much it will take up the time. That's why I was recommending saying like when you are preparing, make sure like you take one objective at a time and prepare. And once you are comfortable and prepared, then you can, when you take up the uh, practice exam, then probably like you can just say like, okay, now I'm ready to take up all the questions related to the all the objectives. Cool. So you're a Power Platform functional consultant that needs to model relationships between tables, and you decide to use connections. You need to configure the components in Microsoft Dataverse to support your requirements. To answer, drag and drop the component that needs to be configured for each requirement. A component can be used once, more than once, or not at all. So here you can see there are 3 questions where you have to choose 3 components, but they have given you 5. So clearly, like we can't use everything. And option is that you can also use the same component multiple times. That is also feasible. So let us look at the answer, then I will walk you through what it is. So here you are creating a connection rule, right? So to describe a relationship between 2 records, you will be using connection rule because they asked you to do the connection rule in here. So to expand the list of connection rule categories, you will be using the choices. Normally choices will provide you the list of items that you can use to group the connection rules. So you will be expanding the list of connection rule categories and use the choices for that. To enable connections to be made to a table. So this is where you will be using the table. So you should configure the table to enable connections to be made to the table. So it is a setting at the table level in order to enable connections. So the settings on the tables will have an enable connections checkbox. Make sure you tick that and that will enable you to set up the connections. You won't be configuring a connection because a connection is linked to between 2 records, but it doesn't describe the purpose of the relationship. You can't configure a solution because they are not as part of this particular questions that they have asked here. They are not related to the questions here that has been listed. So that's the key point in here in terms of preparing for the questions. Just a last question in the sample. So what you get a idea is around the feel of the type of questions that you can be expecting in the exam, and also like it will provide you like a gap analysis, like okay, how much you know, how much yet you have to prepare. So normally nothing wrong in taking the practice test, and don't in the first attempt if you score really less marks, don't worry about that because the purpose of that is not that. It's more around making sure to test your knowledge and identify the gap areas so you can focus on them. Cool. You're a functional consultant implementing a Power Platform solution. Your organization uses Dataverse classic flows. You need to consider how to configure the workflows. How should you configure the workflows? So initiate from another workflow, run immediately, contains a wait step or step in a business process workflow. So you will choose the property in here. So if you want to initiate another workflow, what you do, if you want to run immediately, what you choose, and so on. So if you look at the answers, so if you want to initiate from another workflow, you will be creating some child workflows. If you want to run things immediately, then it is a real time. So if it contains a wait step, then it's actually a background thing step. And then if you want to include a step in a business process flow, this is an on demand. So as you can see here, the explanations are provided in here. So this will help you to just choose on why certain answers are the correct answer. So child property will help you to initiate another workflow if required. And Dataverse classic workflow, if it is set, then probably you are running things in real time. And you should set the Dataverse classic flow to run in the background if you have wait steps. So not in the foreground so that you are not just keep waiting there. You should set the on-demand property to allow Dataverse classic workflow to be called as a step in the business process flow. So again, if you want to learn more about the topic, you have what does the different type of flows within Dataverse really mean. So those are some of the sample questions that we wanted to look at as part of configuring Microsoft Dataverse. As you can see, the type of questions that are getting asked as part of the practice test. As I told you, like if you can't provide the right answers the first time, it's not a big deal. But this is just more or less getting familiarized around the type of questions that may be asked during the practice test. Okay, so let us move on to the next skill, which is to be measured is creating apps by using Power Apps. So what are the questions that you can expect from this topic and also some of the tips? So when you are creating applications by using Microsoft Power Apps, around 15 to 20% of the questions will be asked in this topic. So if you look at here, Dataverse 20 to 25, this is 15 to 20, so close to 40 to 45% of the questions will be around these two topics, half of the exam topics, to be honest. So creating model-driven applications, you need to know how to create and configure forms, views, charts, and dashboards. How do you configure sitemap? Because I think with model-driven application, you start with a sitemap in order to edit anything. So you select the applicable assets for the application. This includes how do you create tables, forms, views, business process flows, and dashboards and charts. And how do you share a model-driven application? Because creating an application is one part, and then the ability to share it is the another part. And how do you apply the organizational branding? So with model driven applications, you can apply the branding, and how do you go about doing that? And that's again an important thing to understand. So this is with the help of teams that you will be doing the organizational branding. Next part is creating your Canvas application. So as I told you, within Power Apps, you can create model driven application, Canvas application, and portal application. So you will have to prepare the things around topics around these three things. So how do you create a Canvas app? How do you configure Dataverse as a data source for that? How do you create Canvas app screens? So for instance, like how do you create a screen? How do you add the controls to the screen? How do you add formulas? Where we discussed about formulas in Canvas apps, it's like Excel formulas. And how do you use reusable components and libraries? And how do you configure offline capabilities for your Canvas apps? How do you run Power Automate flows? And how do you interpret app checker results? And because app checker allows you to check your app for any accessibility issues, how do you go about using that tool? How do you manage and monitor your applications and uh, analytics data? So these are again important topics that you will be preparing when you learn about Canvas applications. With portal applications, how do you create a portal application? How do you expose the Dataverse data? How do you configure the portal pages? And the security is another important aspect, and also authentication. So with the portal, I told you like you can build anonymous websites as well as authenticated websites. So how do you go about configuring them is another thing to learn with the Power Apps portal applications. So some of the tips to know, there are primarily three ways to build Power Apps. They are, you can use a template, you can use a data source, or you can start with a blank canvas. So you can use any one of these ways in order to create your Power Apps application. And you can include common controls in Power Apps. This includes galleries, forms, media, as well as charts. So these are the things that you can include. Okay, cool. So that's the galleries, forms, media, and charts. That are the common controls that you can add. And then you can use text controls for all the purposes like displaying text, numbers, dates, and how do you using for calculating currencies. If you want to move from one screen to another screen, normally you use the event to the on selected property. So if you say like if you choose a button, and button will have an on select property, within the on select property you will be assigning a formula saying like okay, navigate to this screen or the other screen. So navigation is typically added to the on select property of your button or the icon control. As I told, portal application is an anonymous or authenticated website. Normally it can be branded, personalized, and provide a self-service experience. The portal management model-driven app. So this is going to provide you ability to manage passwords, contact information, registration, and profile related information. So portal app and portal management app, they both, one is basically for all the consumers to get in. The management app is mainly for you to manage who your customers are and their details. Okay, so the next one we are going to look at is some sample questions related to creating apps by using Power Apps. So let me pull this through. So here going to have 5 questions. Look at that. And I'm going to show questions related to Power Apps alone. And of course, we can choose this. I'll skip the instructions for now, but you have to read through it when you are taking up the exam. Just keep that in mind. So this is an interesting one. So this is like a case study one. So with the case study, like you can see the instructions. This case study contains a series of questions that present the same scenario. Each question in the series contain a unique solution that might meet the stated goals. Some question sets might have more than one correct solution, while the others may not have a correct solution. You can't go back or review questions once this type of uh, okay, you can't go back and review the questions of this type on the actual certification exam. So keep that in mind. Once you finish this section, you can't come back to the case study questions again. So you are a Power Platform functional consultant. You add a editable. Okay, I think we missed this one, so we should be going here. So you are a Power Platform functional consultant. You deploy a portal application. You need to allow external users to access their data and submit requests. So solution is you enable open registration. Does this meet your goal? So here it's already been asked. The question is you have to deploy a portal application and you want to make sure to allow external users to access their data as well as to submit their request. Just enabling open registration, is that going to resolve it? So the answer is yes. Why it is yes? Because open registration provides you the least restrictive sign-up configuration, which means they can easily register by providing their user identity. So yes, you can provide them access to access their data and submit requests by enabling the open registration. So you are a Power Platform consultant and you deploy a portal app. You need to allow external users to access their data and submit the request. Send the user an invitation code. Does this solution meet the goal? So you are actually getting external users. So here it is external users who wants to get access to the data and submit requests within the portal. So sending the user an invitation code, is that sufficient enough? In this case, yes, because external users, you can just send an invitation code and they can redeem the invitation code and to when they are signing up the portal, and which means each invitation code that you are sending will be unique to the contact. You are a Power Platform functional consultant. You deploy a portal app. You need to allow external users to access their data and submit their request. So you add external users as guests to Azure Active Directory. Does the solution meet the goal? Which I think are normally like external users, how do you add them into Azure Active Directory? So if you add them as guests in Active Directory, can they get access? Not really. The reason is Azure Active Directory is not used to grant guest users access to the portal. It's mainly for the B2B or B2C uh, you should use to allow guests to access the portal. So if you are using AD, then probably it's only for users who are part of your AD, they can access it. But if you want to bring in external users, then use the Azure B2B or a B2C option for that. Cool. So this is how like the case study would be like here it asks the questions, but you will be reading a lot of things around this is a fictitious organization, this is their requirement and so on. But the purpose is like pretty much the questions will be related to in this fashion. The another set of question that you can check here is like you have got 3 statements and they're asking you to choose yes or no. And here you have to choose yes or no for each and every statement. And here you can see there are 3 questions, which means you will have 3 points in here. You are a Power Platform functional consultant. You add the editable grid control to a custom entity named building as shown in the exhibit. So exhibit, when you look at it here like this. So you have an editable grid in here. You create a business rule to validate the data in the building table. The business rule references columns in the active buildings view. You create a dashboard and add the active buildings view to the dashboard. You need to determine how the editable grid can be used. For each of the following statements, select yes if the statement is true, otherwise select no. Users will be able to edit rows in the active buildings view. Users will be able to edit rows in subgrids of the buildings, and user or the business rule will work on the dashboard. If you look at here, and if you correlate with the explanation there, so the users will be able to edit rows in the active buildings view. The editable build has been configured, which means it will be enabled for all the views when you're accessing the table. So only thing is, if they are using the web client, it will be accessible. They will not be able to use the editable grid in the mobile client. But here it's not specifically saying about mobile client, so you don't need to worry about that. So here you can say the users will be able to edit. But if they have specifically mentioned mobile client, you need to be careful. The second one is users will be able to edit rows in subgrids of the building table. So the editable grid has been configured only for the table. So if you want a subgrid, they need to be configured separately for each and every table. So the subgrid, they haven't mentioned anything in here about the subgrid. So it's only the editable grid is only for the prime table. So the business rule will work in the dashboard. The business rule will not work in the dashboard. So business rules require all the columns to be contained in the view to operate. So that's why the business rules, they don't trigger in the dashboards. So that is something to keep in mind. So to get more information about this, so in terms of what you can do with editable grids and what you can't do, this is where you have to make sure to do that. And also it is good to learn how to do the actions in the editable grid. Okay, moving on from that. So you are a functional consultant implementing a model-driven application. The users need to see only tables in the app navigation that are relevant to them, the type of deployment they are using, and also the client in using which they are accessing. You need to restrict the tables on the sub area in the sitemap to meet the requirements. Which sub area property that you can use for the requirement and select the appropriate actions. So make the entity visible only to users who can create rows. Make the table invisible if using on-premises, or make the entity invisible if using in a browser. So the properties you are going to do is it a privilege or a SKU or a client or offline availability? I quickly walk you through this. So if you look at this, you want to make the entity visible only to users when they create rows. So that is more or less like a privilege. So privilege is like actually the permissions. So when you use you normally use the privilege property to control visibility of a table in the sitemap. When no privilege property is specified, then the users with the read privilege from the security role will be able to see the table. I think we saw in that one of the previous questions saying okay, you will be assigning a security role. If you provide a read role, then probably they will be able to see it. If you remove the read security role, then they won't be able to see the table. Make the table invisible if using on-premises. So you can use the SKU property, which will control the visibility of the table based on the version or the deployment of Dynamics 365 or Power Platform. So if you are using the on-premises one, then probably it will be hidden. Make the entity visible if you are using a web browser. So you can use the client property to control the visibility of the table. So you can specify whether it is cool. So you can specify whether it is a web or it is a Outlook client, and then you can specify the client, and then making sure so for that type of clients, you can set the visibility for whether it is visible for the user or not. So that is something to keep in mind. Great. So coming back to The skills again. So we saw the Power Apps. The next one is looking at creating and managing Power Automate. So what are the things that you have to get prepared when it comes to Power Automate? Around 15 to 20% of the questions will be asked using Power Automate. So here we'll be looking at creating flows. You recommend types of flows and flow components, including when to use a classic workflow and triggering a workflow using Dataverse connectors, and how do you run actions and implement logic control. So this is branches, loops, conditions, and how do you add dynamic content and expressions, and also test and troubleshoot your flows. So those are the things that will be covered as part of your initial flows. And how do you create and manage your business process is another aspect that you will be looking, especially under the part of business process flows. So then you have got your business process flow. What you will be doing is how do you configure them, how do you define the stages and steps in them, and how do you configure parallel branches in them, and how do you manage the business process flow for particular table for a business process flow. And also the desktop flows is another aspect. So what are the types you have got, the use cases where you will be using them, and the difference between attended and unattended flows. And again, how do you implement variables, loops, conditional statements in there? And how do you monitor the runs of your flows? That is again an important aspect to consider. So with Power Automate flows, like Power Automate was also called previously as Microsoft Flow, and it is a cloud service that automates across one or more systems. It is built on top of the Azure Logic Apps. So there is something to keep in mind. So Azure Logic Apps, as you know, like this is an enterprise integration platform on the cloud, and Power Automate is built on that. So if the difference between that is like if you're building applications using components within the Power Platform family, normally you go down using the Power Automate for that. The types of Power Automate flows are event-driven flows, business process flows, and desktop flows. And those are the type of flows that you can create and as well as you can use. Every flow has got two parts. I think we have clearly mentioned that every part during the training session. So triggers and actions. A trigger is the starting point of your flow, such as like the trigger can be like a new email arriving to your mailbox or a file being placed inside your OneDrive for Business. So this can be any sort of those the activities that can trigger a workflow. And then followed by that is any actions that you are taking. So once the trigger is there, then probably it is going to execute other actions within the flow. So the admin center again is the central location where your tenant admins and environment admins can manage the organization's data policies and environments. So admin center is what you will be using for making your organization's data policies and environments. So let us quickly look at some sample questions on Power Automate Flow. Let me quickly get in there for you. So this is going to be focusing around questions related to just Power Automate. So the different flows that we have been discussing, we'll be looking at questions related to that. Cool. So let me get the objectives back. So this time I won't include any of the common complex ones. So we can see some interesting questions in here. Cool. So you are a Power Platform functional consultant for building a maintenance organization. So this is a building maintenance organization, and you create custom tables like location, building, floor, tenant, and project. You use business process flows to ensure that the data is entered consistently. A business process flow starts on the building table, which includes stages for tenant and project tables. The final stage is on project, and you want to run a classic workflow when the user clicks on finish in the last stage of the business process flow. So for each of those following statements, select yes if the statement is true or select no. So classic workflow, does it need to be on real time, or the classic workflow must be on demand? The classic workflow must trigger on create, or the classic workflow, the table for the classic workflow must be built